everybody. So we've got quite a good turnout tonight. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Sarah and Nina for organising this, as always. Brilliant. It's really lucky in Brighton to have a network like this, so keep coming to the events. So I've just moved to Brighton recently, and I've also become a dad as well. So I thought, everyone keeps asking me about baby photos. Show me the baby photos. How do you do it? Well, here is Jasmine, my daughter. Just after she was born, hence the alien head on the left there. That's what happens when you get squeezed through on the way out. There she is, looking a bit more round than normal. There she is, looking kind of slightly older. And there she is in actually what was my christening dress when I was a baby. She's now it's gone on to the next generation, and she's now inherited it. That's lucky. So we don't have to have a talk, we could just keep looking at baby photos. Okay, let's keep moving. That is me. So in Myers-Briggs type terms, my type is INTJ. For those of you who understand what that means, it'll give you a little bit of insight about who I am. I'm from Newcastle as well, in the northeast of England, and found my way down here via London in the last few years. I did my organisational psychology MSc. I've done a diploma in transformational coaching. But my first degree was actually in chemistry, and then I had a 15-year career in music. So it's a very unusual sort of career path that's led me to where I am now. But about 10 years ago or so, I got really into Carl Jung and his work through psychological type. I found it really insightful and helpful for me, and then started becoming more knowledgeable. And to the point where now I'm also on the board for the British Association for Psychological Type, BAPT, or BAPT as some people call it. I'm the treasurer for that. And we run an annual conference. It's an international conference in the UK, bringing some of the sort of most foremost people in the sort of psychological type world to present talks and so on. It's a really good get together. I've also just started the Brighton Jungian Psychology Meetup. So if you're on meetup.com, look out for that. We had our first one last night. In a week, we've got over 100 members. It's the fastest growing meetup group I've ever seen. So join that. If you're interested in Jung in general, then this is something to come to. We're going to have monthly meetups, more excuses to go to the pub and have some fun. There's me in my music days with my bass. That was my instrument. So there's different lenses on personality. I think lots of different ways can equally be valid at looking at the same thing, but just give a different perspective. And trait is, if you're a psychologist, you'll probably have studied trait more than anything else. It will be the thing that you found in lectures and research and everything along the way academically. And trait is the most obvious of the lenses, because it's kind of a bit like what you see is what you get. I mean, we have physical traits like height and weight. And psychological traits it's a bit of an analogy that it's a bit similar. It's something you can measure the size of and then compare it to somebody else. Type is a different kettle of fish, and we'll go into it in a minute. You can see it's quite easily misunderstood by people. Parts is something that hasn't really been in the mainstream for, certainly not in psychology, but in psychotherapy it has been over the years. We're going to look at that. That's where I'm at in a minute, parts. That's what I'm really into. We'll look at a bit about type first. I mean, there's Carl Jung, when he's a bit younger. He wrote the book Psychological Types in 1921. Has anyone read it? One person's read it. It's well done, because it's really hard to read, right? It's absolutely one of the densest things you can ever possibly read.
Is that one before Archetypes?
If you're talking about what the collective works, he's talking about the book. He wrote this much. He's got 21 volumes of stuff. And they're so dense. Like, to read it takes a real struggle, right, to get through it. He wrote about archetypes. We'll look at those in a minute. So he discovered this theory of psychological type through various means. I mean, psychology was a bit different back in those days, and he was as much of kind of a philosopher as he was a psychologist by today's standards. He looked at the history of things that why people showed opposite tendencies, ways of being that seemed to conflict. He looked at the history of it, He exchanged letters with other psychologists. He observed people. He was actually a psychiatrist and did clinical work. He observed people he works with. He did a lot of introspection. A lot of type was, as opposed to modern trait stuff, which is done through a lot of empirical research generally. A lot of Jung's stuff he found inside, through introspection. He studied the mind from the inside out. And if any of you know about his Red Book experience, that's something else. He went to the fringes of his mind, really, to find some of this stuff. But the real key about type is opposites, polarity, one-sidedness. He called it the problem of opposites. That was kind of the sort of subtitle. But the idea of polarity and opposition is kind of innate to who we are as people, physically as well as psychologically. Like, we're all aware of having two hands, and the idea that we've got some kind of one-sidedness, that we generally feel more comfortable with one hand than the other. But we can use both of them. Does everyone realise you've got a dominant eye? Has everyone ever done any archery or shooting or anything? You ever feel like a dominant eye? Like, point at that speaker over there. Point at the speaker, and then close one eye, and then the other eye, and opposite, just switch between them. And you'll notice that one of the eyes, your finger's still pointing to the speaker, and the other one isn't. You've got a dominant eye. One of your eyes actually leads the way when you're actually doing something. Most people go through life not even realising this. That's the sort of idea. And this is kind of how one-sidedness actually works in practice, is that we don't even realise we are one-sided. Like, some people just laugh there because they go, oh my God, I've got a dominant eye. Also, Jung wrote about 8 types. People have heard about Myers-Briggs and 16-type model. Well, actually, there were 8 types in Jung's original model. But they were not really types of people. He didn't like that idea. For him, they were types of, some people say types of consciousness, or I like to say types of mental process. Actually, the handouts that you've got there actually are descriptions of, or more modern descriptions of Jung's 8 types. And the way they become types of people is that he'd say people, he saw people in his clinical work who were very one-sided, who had some mental health problems and who sometimes exhibited only one of these mental processes in an extreme version. And it was very one-sided. And type also is a cognitive model. It's a model about mental processes. It's not a behavioural model about looking at just patterns of behaviour. That's one thing where people kind of misunderstand it. Myers-Briggs, people are more familiar with, that takes some Jung's model, but it turns it into something with 4 dichotomies, 4 opposites, and I have my issues with that. There's a lot of type bashing. Who's seen stuff on LinkedIn? Yeah. It's everywhere, right? A lot of type bashing, and actually I think some of it is quite extreme, and often it's quite unfair. There's blogs and journalists and media out there, people having a go at type all the time. A lot of it's quite misguided. A lot of people misunderstand the theory, because it's quite easy. If you look at it with the mindset of trait psychology, and then judge it as if you're expecting it to follow those rules, then it's always going to disappoint, because it's not. It comes from a completely different paradigm. People think it's something about boxes. Oh, put me in a box. It's not. It's when you actually don't understand the theory, it's not like that at all. No more than being left or right-handed is putting you in a box. Most people are just kind of happy with the idea that we've got 2 hands, but yeah, one of them's just a little bit more comfortable than the other one. We have a little bit more facility in some way, somehow. It's more natural. MBTI, it's not those free online tests. There's a lot of things out there which kind of talk about type and MBTI, but that's not it. The MBTI is an actual research instrument. It's published by a global multi-million-pound company, which is huge and employs occupational psychologists. If you want to see some actual peer-reviewed paper and get really into some of the let's say the opposite side of the argument that will help to dispel some of the attacks. This one here is one to actually look out for that just came out in the last few months. If you search for that on Google Scholar, look for Moyle and Hacks in 2018. They've got a really good paper, and you'll see lots of links if you want to read more into it. When it comes to actually validity and reliability, which a lot of people sort of criticise MBTI for, a lot of that's quite misguided in the sense that it's got quite a lot of what we call convergent construct validity, with the big five and with other forms of personality assessment. It correlates quite strongly with other measures of personality. It's not for selection, however, so you can't choose people for a job ethically using MBTI or psychological type. Because it's the case fact is you may have a preference for one way of doing things, but it's not to say you can't develop the other way. And so if you exclude people from a job, from something, just because it's their preference, it's not actually assessing their ability to do the job. So there's less predictive validity with MBTI.
So Richard, I think it's probably worth saying only really dodgy psychologists would ever use this for selection.
It's true, yeah.
If you hear about them, let us know.
Yeah,
We'll go and do something.
Good word. Yeah, and if you're going for a job and someone's trying to select you using this stuff, I wouldn't go for the job personally because it's not that difficult to do that. So another thing people need to realise is that there were some academic criticisms early on, and type's been around for so long that the history goes back way back decades. Before 1998, there were some pretty fair criticisms about the MBTI's validity and reliability because it didn't really measure up that well. But what the critics don't realise is that actually in 1998, they completely redesigned the MBTI to create the current form M of the questionnaire using item response theory, which is a pretty robust theory for creating questionnaires and assessments, and actually dealt with a lot of those problems. So when people actually criticise it, they need to realise that a lot of the criticisms are outdated. And actually the BPS, if you're a test user, qualified, you can go online and download an official BPS expert review of the MBTI from 2014. Here we have 3 stars means adequate or reasonable, 4 stars means good. 3 stars, construct validity is adequate. Criterion related validity also adequate, and reliability is good. It's a bit like doing the weather forecast there. But yeah, there you go. So it's straight from their BPS. So don't always believe what you hear on the news or on LinkedIn. But I think there are problems with type, and having really studied it in depth, I can see that there are issues. There are some issues. I'm not just saying, it's perfect and you should use it all the time, it's great. One of the problems with type is it lacks integration with modern psychology. It kind of comes from 100 years ago from Jung, and even the language is not being tied in, and the concepts not being tied in with modern cognitive psychology, with other aspects of mental process that's come after it. So it's kind of slightly divorced and separate from other modern psychology concepts. I think it needs updating. The concepts need revising and explaining in a different way that actually makes sense. So in terms of modern psychology, type assessments, sometimes it's seen as a snapshot, like you would do with a trait, almost like, what am I like right now? But if you're actually working with people with type, you really have to look at their history and their development path to understand what their actual underlying type is. Because what someone sees themselves as now as a snapshot might actually not actually reveal those underlying preferences. They might actually be looking at how they've developed within their type. There's a lot of unethical, like we were talking about, and amateur use, people just kind of like making blogs on the internet, things like that. There's this baby thrown out with the bathwater problem with type, is that there really is some, I think, very important things to learn about human behaviour and human nature from type. Something that isn't captured in trait theory, and isn't captured in other areas of psychology. But because there is issues with it, often the whole thing gets thrown out, and therefore it gets excluded from the academic world, and we lack the research that would actually help to integrate it and create some kind of meta-theory, which would actually get the best of all the worlds, and develop personality theory. So I actually see Myers-Briggs 16 types as developmental pathways. And when you look at type, those 8 types that Jung talks about, which are on those sheets that you're looking at, these sometimes called function attitudes, sometimes called cognitive processes, sometimes called cognitive modes. I like that one personally. But the MBTI type is defined by one of those which is like a dominant function, and one of them which is an auxiliary function. But theory says that we have all 8 of these. So when someone's going, oh, I'm this and I'm that, well, we are all 8. But realizing your type is about actually subtly understanding which one is most current, most the sort of central theme that you consistently get drawn back to in your life. The MBTI has these 4 abstracted pairs, like overall, introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, judging, perceiving. And again, I think that's that actually confuses the matters because it gets away from these 8 functions, which are actually what we experience and can recognize in our actually everyday experience. I've just defined like the idea of a preference in MBTI myself as what's called an intrinsic attentional bias. It's the idea that we've got something that's built in that draws our attention when we have the freedom to do so back to one way of being. But let's talk about parts, because that's why it's interesting, that's why people come here today. So the reason I talked about type quite a lot there is because I guess this is related strongly to the personality parts theory, and it kind of builds on that, it's related to it. So the idea of parts is about multiplicity of self, in a way. So the main implied textbook model in psychology is that we have a single unified self, or personality. Yeah, so who's done like various personality assessment questionnaires and things like that, right? Everyone's pretty done that. It's generally asking you, like, even if it's not directly saying this, like, what is your personality like? That's kind of the implied question. What is your personality like? But in that is an assumption that you have a personality. There is some singular thing that it's asking you about. It's a massive assumption that it's not even really thought about. And actually, when you think about what it's asking you, what do you do when you go, oh, what am I like? How do I answer these questions? What you actually end up turning to is what I call a narrative construct. You look to this sort of story about yourself, which tells you this, which kind of acts like this stand-in for this singular, unified personality. But when you actually look at yourself in real life, life consists of a series of moments, and you are different. You can act very differently from one moment to the next, right? So when we're asking ourselves what a personality is, you can look at it in different ways, and actually we're doing some very clever little construction to even answer that question, what your personality is like. And with parts, we're kind of going back to, well, actually, let's look at those moments in life and start actually examining those, like, what am I actually being like at that moment? And seeing sort of when that personality that you're being at that moment starts reappearing and sort of coming back and starts to become some actual recognizable subpart that is very qualitatively different to other parts. We can recognize, so in this guy, John Rowan, who's quite a famous transpersonal psychologist, and he wrote a book called Subpersonalities. It's a really good one. So if you want to know about parts and you want to know some of the history and things behind all different models that use parts, that's the book to read, I would say. John Rowan, it's from 1990, it's called Subpersonalities, right? He would define subpersonality as the semi-permanent and semi-autonomous region of the personality capable of acting as a person. And it's everyday stuff, right? We all recognise the idea of parts. When I talk to people about this, they go, yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, like, especially when you think, well, part, you could be in sort of conflict between different parts within yourself. Part of me thinks that, part of me thinks, on one hand I think this, on the other hand I think that. We all have this idea of having very different perspectives all at the same time. They're all very like different subpersonalities. And you can recognise in other people as that what I call the factor of, oh, they're being like that again. Right? Who's in any kind of reasonably close relationship with another human being? Anybody? Right, okay. So you start to recognise this, you'll talk, oh, they're being like that again. It could be, whoever it is, like a partner or parent or brother or sister or someone you live with, anything like that. And you start to recognise these very separate parts. It's a bit like, sometimes it can be a bit like Jekyll and Hyde, literally complete like switching like from one person to the next in the same person. And we all know what that's like, We see the good and bad sides of people, and the more, when you initially meet somebody, people sort of hide this from each other, don't they? They sort of, we hide the parts of ourselves, especially the ones we don't want people to see, but over time you can't help it, it comes out. Till you know somebody and you know all the different sides and all the different parts of it. And the idea of parts it's had many different names in different models, like the idea of ego states, which comes from transactional analysis. That's one way of looking at it. Like internal objects or self-schemas. There's like about 100 that John Rowan lists in his book of different ways that people have categorized this same concept of subpersonalities. But why not states? Why not think about it like in states as like, yes, I am a singular person, but I'm just different states at different times. Like I was saying, because the more you look at it, the more you realise that at the same time, all of these different things are there at the same time, and they're all kind of like feeding into this central sort of awareness that we have. And you can become into this kind of dilemma, like I was talking about this conflict. Who's ever been in a real dilemma, like where they're absolutely torn, where different parts of yourself like really have different needs or something. It can be quite extreme. The other thing about parts is multiple personality disorder. So I talk to people and they go, yeah, I know what you mean, yeah, I've got different parts, but I'm not crazy. There's that thing. It's become stigmatized because like there's this thing, this is where the only place most people have heard about the idea of multiplicity is through what was called multiple personality disorder, became renamed actually more recently dissociative identity disorder. But they always have to preface it because the whole idea of parts becomes sort of stigmatized in a negative way. To be split, but the idea of something like multiple personality disorder, as it was known, it's quite an extreme case. Where parts of the self literally don't have any connection at all, or don't even realise the other one exists, and they can switch. But this splitting, like anything, is on a spectrum, and in any sort of typical normal person, there is a level of splitting of the personality that we can be aware of and recognise. Like me just describing it in people that you might know in everyday life. It's obvious when you think about it. And parts models are often used in psychotherapy. Like Jung himself really explicitly did talk about this idea. Who knows about Gestalt? Who's ever used study Gestalt? So one of the techniques in that is the chair work, where you sit people in a chair and they can take on different roles or parts of themselves, sitting in different positions, like physically moving around. And then there's another thing called IFS, or internal family systems. That's the thing to look out for as well. It's really interesting. An American guy called Richard Schwartz created that. And it sees he recognised that in the same way that you can have dysfunctional relationships within a family, a real family, like family in everyday life. It's like we have a family of parts in our minds that actually can have relationships between them, and when the relationships break down, it leads to all kinds of problems. So he works with that, the idea that you can dialogue with different parts of yourself. It can seem a bit crazy, but when you actually do it, it can be quite profoundly useful. Transactional analysis is another thing that I was talking about. If you're into coaching, there's a lady called Professor Tatiana Bakharova, who's a professor at British University. I can't remember which one. I think it may be in Oxford. She's written a book about developmental coaching, and that has got what she calls mini-selves. But that's very much a model of multiplicity in coaching as well. So I'm giving you lots of nice things to read. You could sit there over Christmas and have a nice read. Well, what's underlying these parts, and any model of the mind, I think, is attention. Right? And in psychology, attention is this idea, this focus of mental processes. Like what the mind is doing at any particular time is to a large degree determined by attention, because it's like this focus of that functioning of the processes into one particular area. When you look at attention research. I can see there's these two sort of timeless, two different areas, what we call automatic, bottom-up, what I call wandering attention, which is related to what's called the unconscious mind. That unconscious mind is kind of an old term, like Jung and people like that used it. You could substitute like subconscious or non-conscious or whatever you want, but it's not non-conscious in the sense that you're in a coma. You know, it's a different kind of, it's a different meaning. It's unconscious in the sense that you're not deliberately, intentionally doing something. In the sense that it is like autopilot. Yeah, and we spend a lot. Everyone recognizes times when they're on autopilot and their mind's just kind of doing its thing, right? There's actually research on it, really interesting research about mind wandering that sort of shows that most of us are mind wandering about 50% of the time. You know, and the other one is the executive, top-down, intentional consciousness, ego sort of conscious, like awareness, and that's attention. If I go right, pay attention to that plant over there. You know, you can go right. I will pay attention to that plant. There. Now I am looking at it, and you know, you can always say to yourself and make yourself do it in your head. You actually made an intentional decision, and you're also aware in the moment that you are doing it. You're aware of being aware. Whereas unconscious attention, you know, if you drift off, and I don't mind if you do that when I'm talking, that's fine. Because another unconscious part of you is still listening to me. So that's fine. So yeah, the intentional executive attention and this automatic mind drift. And we kind of live our lives in this tension between these two things. There's kind of this belief that we spend a lot of our time, we are these kind of rational, controlled, deliberate beings with conscious will, but actually we know that's not really true. You know, our mind is on its own little thing, doing whatever it wants to do, and to a certain degree we have to kind of go with the flow of that, otherwise we're kind of fighting a losing battle. The other thing is the environment can also orient our attention as well. It can kind of grab our attention, depending on kind of how strong if you look across this idea of like strong and weak situations in psychology. Anyone heard of that? The idea of strong or weak situation. So like, you know, a strong situation is something that has, in this case, it'll command a strong effect over your attention. You know, so no matter how, a really strong situation, no matter how hard you try to deliberately concentrate and focus, it will grab your attention, it will make you orientate yourself. It will be like someone popping a balloon next to you or something like that, you know. But there's weak situations that you can kind of overcome. So I'm dealing with like kind of crying, screaming baby and things like that, you know, it's a bit of a distraction. This idea of attention, we're living our lives a lot, and actually the unconscious attention, the automatic wandering bottom-up attention, that's, for me, is where type sits. That's where type preference sits. Is that for each of us, this wandering attention is drawing us two different aspects of our mind processing, two different aspects of the world around us. So when we spend some of our time deliberately trying to do stuff with our executive attention, but then as soon as you let go of that, and we can't hold on to it forever, our mind off it goes, does its own thing. Sometimes that will be grabbed by the attention, by the environment. But it's to say that, you know, this is where we're different as human beings, is that for some people, their mind's attention is just trying to draw them towards one kind of way of doing things, or way of attending to the world, and another person is drawing them another way. That's what type's about for me. It's an intrinsic attentional bias. It's at the level of attention, and you can't help it. Let's do a little exercise. I'm going to invite you to do something now. So I'm going to try and so you can actually just see these things that I'm talking about in action. I want you to see. We're going to do mindfulness is actually an attention, awareness, and building exercise, right? And even if you don't look at it from some of the sort of more spiritual sort of sides that it has as well, just looking at it as an attention exercise is very useful. So what I'm going to ask you to do in a minute is we're going to sit there comfortably. I find a kind of comfortable place to sit, and I just get you comfortable. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Just sit and watch everybody else doing it. Fine. But it's just a little exercise to look at the mind. You know, I'm telling you here about what the mind is like, and there are different kinds of attention. But like, why should you believe me? Right? I want you to believe yourself by just actually doing an experiment to actually see that this is true. What we're going to do is we're going to use our executive top-down attention to focus on your breathing. Right? It could actually be any kind of stimulus that we use, but we're using breathing because if you can hear me, I know that you're breathing. We know it's there. Right? We're also there's this other bottom up, wandering, automatic type of attention, it's going to be there. And at some point, we can do this for a few minutes, and I bet you this, at some point your mind will wander away from focusing on your breath, okay? And that's good, that's completely fine, that's normal. And at that point that you do it, just notice that it's happened, trying to notice where your mind has wandered off to, what's happening, and then just go, okay, let's just guide our attention back to the breathing again. You got me? That's all it is, really easy. Watch the breathing, just pay attention to it, just be aware of it. Keep your mind on it using your deliberate focused attention. If your mind wanders, notice where you've gone, bring it back. Okay? I'm going to do that. So just take a minute to relax. Let go of all of the worries of the world. Forget about Brexit. Don't think about any of that stuff. Just let yourself relax and just generally focus your mind on your breathing. Just notice it. Just be aware of it. Just feel what it's like, the breathing coming through. If you're breathing through the nose, you feel what it's like coming through the nostrils. Feel where it goes in your body. Feel where it fills up in your lungs and relaxes and releases again. Just gently, naturally focusing on that breath. Just keeping it there. Focus on your breath. And if you notice your mind wander, just bring it back. Just gently. Notice where you've been. Again, just bring it back to the breath. Wandering the spine, just see where you've gone. Okay, now stop it there. Just bring yourself back, just gently, and just shake yourself off. Did anyone's mind wander from their brain? Did anyone's not? One person, okay. So that's really good. So do you practice mindfulness? You do? Yeah. So that, this is something you can practice and improve on that. But that was only 2 minutes. People practice mindfulness for 10 minutes, an hour, more even than that. So it's one of these things that you can build upon. But think about that. For 2 minutes, it's pretty difficult for most people to focus their mind deliberately using their executive attention for a couple of minutes even. Sometimes in 30 seconds. It's difficult. Does anyone want to share where do they wander off to? Anyone want to kind of give us some idea? Even if it was a voice going, why are we doing this? This is silly. This is ridiculous.
Okay. The sound of the wind took me back to memory of dancing cells from Brighton seafront this time of year, about 2 o'clock in the morning after a rather good party.
That's amazing. What a great place to go.
Yeah.
And what was that? Was it quite a vivid memory? Was it?
Yeah, I remembered wearing my favourite fake furry jacket. It being really cold.
Yeah. So you have, can you see it visually, or can you hear the sounds of being
Well,
there?
it was the sound of the wind that kind of jogged the memory.
Yeah. So you're partly re-experiencing that moment. So when we're looking at, I don't know if anyone's able to see those sheets, but that process, that cognitive process, that mode that she's just describing there, was what was called introverted sensing. So going back to like re-experiencing like some sort of concrete actual experience. And things in the present moment can act like triggers to like take us back to these kind of concrete memories and experiences. So the idea of this like Jung's model and this is that we all have all 8 of these functional processes. Some of them draw us more often. Is that something you do often, going back to memories and
sometimes I find music often triggers memories.
So it's something you go back to quite a lot, maybe.
I mean, I've done BTI several times, so that's not an entire surprise for you to kind of.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's interesting. These things, when you start noticing over time, becoming more mindful in your everyday life of what your mind is doing in a particular time, you can start to see the patterns of like where is it going, what are you being drawn to. And the more aware of these things you are, the easier it is to understand what type is about and just see it. So those are 8 different modes, and you can see I've kind of equated them to what is called the sensing and thinking functions. They're much more to do with sort of material, concrete, objective reality. Everything they're to do with things that are known in a way like objects. And there's something much more abstract and slightly energy-like about intuition and feeling. It's more relational. So if you think, I'm not just talking hippie talk here. This is like, if you think like in physics terms, like what actually energy is in a field. When we describe an energetic field, it is the relationship between 2 points. That's how we can. It's the only way we can know it. There's no physical object there in a field. But there is something there to be known, and there is the relationship between the points. Like the gravitational field of the Earth, there's a relationship between the Earth and you. There's nothing. You can't hold gravity. You can't get hold. You can't even see it, but you know it's there, right? And you can know it through your relationship. And that's kind of how intuition and feeling work in a much more relational, less concrete kind of way. There's empirical studies about function attitudes, as they're called as well, these cognitive modes, these functions. Ray Moody did something, and along with Marina Barimini, she's an American girl who did a PhD. It's where these kind of this graph comes from here. This is looking at a Myers-Briggs type, and she was looking at results from a test that sort of measured these 8 functions and sort of what percentage they sort of popped up as importance in that person. So she did some quite interesting statistics with it. There's also some other interesting research about EEG studies. A guy called Dario Nardi, an American from Los Angeles, and they do like with type, with those 8 functions that we're looking at on the sheet. But one of them is usually the dominant function for each person, and that is what the attention is more habitually drawn back to than anything else. It becomes like a central sort of importance of identity amongst all of the 8 functions. That sort of, it's almost like music. You know how you've got a key center in music? Yeah, I know about this because I'm a bass player. And you can basically, you can play a bass note, and that sets kind of a key note that everything else kind of starts to have a relevance to. And the dominant function's a bit like that. It's kind of like the key center of your personality. And this graph on the left it shows a flow state, and when he's doing his EEG research, he sees this flow state quite often. But what he's actually realised is that for different people with different dominant functions, this flow state will actually come into being when they're actually doing tasks that engage that dominant function. It's quite amazing. Like, you're at your best when you're in this state of flow, because all of the regions of the brain, which can sometimes look like this, very much different waveforms in different regions of the brain, and actually all become synchronized, and the whole thing starts working together like one cohesive whole. Positive psychology talks about this flow state, but that's what that's kind of what it looks like in the EEG terms. So if you're engaging your dominant function, you could be engaging a flow state. Your brain's actually working in a really, really efficient way.
Richard,
Yeah.
when you're using flow here, are you using the Csikszentmihalyi definition?
I guess it's similar, yeah, in the sense that it's when you're at your best, I guess, and you're in things are going without you really having to put too much effort in, but you're actually, I don't know if that's the same, but...
Yeah, I think it's the combination of there's enough challenge, but there's enough kind of skill, strength, whatever, so that you're not noticing the time go past because you're really actively engaged, but it's not draining of energy, it's
that's right, I would say, Because when you you're kind of at your best when you're using a dominant function, because you're going with your mind, you're going with your mind's attention. You're going with the flow, so to speak. Absolutely, yeah. So then the next step in this is on top of this 8-function model of these 8-function processes, this guy came into the world to add an extra interesting twist about it. So if we have all of these 8 different functional processes, one of them's usually the dominant, but remember we have all 8 of them. We're not just one thing. John Beebe's a Jungian analyst, so he works with what are called analysands. We don't go with patients. It's clinical work, very deep stuff that stems from Jung's practice, and it's psychotherapy. But he realised from his practice that this predictable set of archetypal character roles express or carry each of the 8 processes that we're looking on there, depending on one's type. What we're saying is that he recognised 8 different sort of characteristic roles or characters basically that people express when they're using the functions. This will become clearer when we see the model in a minute. In terms of validity, he's looked at this through his practice, and he couldn't believe it was actually true at first when he sort of worked this out. So he spent the next 30 years in his clinical work really trying to go, is it actually real? But time and time again, the same thing happens at the point where it's absolutely certain. And I've used this in my work. It's not always easy to spot these characters, but the more you do it, the more you become familiar and see it right in front of your face every day, and you realise, wow, actually how amazing this is. That's the book that John published in 2016, and another guy, Mark Hunziker, in 2016 wrote Depth Typology. So if you want to know more about this particular sort of expansion on psychological type, then this is the place to look. What archetypes are? I used the words archetypes. You were saying archetypes before, right? So sometimes people can go, "Oh, this is a bit of a crazy concept," but it's quite simple in a way. What we're saying is that the word comes from 2 words: archaic and typical. Archaic is like it's something that's found across all time. It's like it's ancient. These ways of being are things that you can look back in history and pretty much you see them crop up again and again throughout all different eras. They're typical, they're found everywhere. So wherever you go in the world, people are going to have these same characters, and the characters will crop up in myths, in stories, in folklore, in media, in the films we watch, in stories, fairy stories, everything. Because they're so fundamental to human nature, they found their way into all kind of culture, all different times, in all different places. You can think of archetypes as like an inherited shared psychological architecture in sort of an abstract schematic form. The way of being that describes these is something that is evolved into us as people. And in this model, where we're linking the functions that we've got there with these archetypal expressions, The function's like what we do. Think of the function as what you do, and the archetype is the way that you do it. So if you're using one of those functions, you're engaging it, that's what you're doing, but you're doing it with a certain characteristic kind of expression. You can call them roles, characters, emotional tones, flavours or qualities of expression. So for a particular person, say for instance, using that introverted sensing as an example, of like going back, re-experiencing concrete experience, sorting through memories and that kind of thing. For some people, just on a very basic level, some of the archetypes are what I call the shadow side, and some are called the light side. So for some people, just on a very basic level, that functioning will have a positive light to it. On others, it will have some kind of a less comfortable way of being, or experience. For me, it's actually in my shadow, and for me, like, I'm constantly undermining myself, like with the past, with memories. So I'm like kind of actually tending to remember the negative rather than the positive. These are the actual, and Nina, you said you like the emojis, the faces. This starts to give a little bit of character, because I think these sort of qualities they've even made their way to, so archetypal, they've made their ways into the emoji system. Now, you'll recognise here, like, it's partly this, if you've read, anyone familiar with transactional analysis? Yeah, so you'll know that sort of parent, adult, child model. And I think it draws on that as well, because, I think absolutely, there is this, they're archetypal, these ways of being, in the sense that being parent-like is a kind of sort of relational dynamic. I mean, how would you describe being parent-like? Like, what is the kind of dynamic? What is it to be parent-like? What is that relationship like with another person? Can be nurturing, yeah. In terms of a good parent, it can definitely. You have a critical parent, sorry?
To tell or instruct.
To tell, yeah, there's some sort of power dynamic, isn't there? There's some kind of like hierarchical thing going on. And that's the level we're talking about, which these are. There's something about the dynamic of the relationship which has a good parent or critical parent. And that's what's archetypal, that this way of taking that stance towards another person has got that kind of quality to it. Okay. I'm just trying to I'll show you how in the part system. So we've got 8 functions and 8 archetypes, and actually you can have all the combinations with each other. That actually gives you 8 times 8, which is 64 different parts. Which is quite a lot, right, to get to know. And I believe actually, we've all got these 64 different parts of ourselves, and we can break it down. But depending on our personality type, there's 8 that will actually become much more prevalent, and you'll notice them even more. So this is a combination of, I've created the mannequins. So if you combine, say, introverted intuition, this is my dominant function, by the way, introverted intuition, for those of you who don't know, with the hero archetype, which is the one that is to do with the dominant function. So you get this way of like visualizing it. You can say, oh, well, this is a little mannequin. It's kind of like a little part of myself. And you can. Sometimes it helps actually when you start thinking about these parts of yourself to draw them yourself, and actually that can be really useful to use art as a way to get to know these people, these parts, subparts. But that's another part of myself, the daimon, the demonic introverted sensing that I was just talking about there. Where memories and past concrete facts seem to undermine me, and they got this really horrible, haunting kind of quality to them. So for me, using that function feels demonic, but I might also have this attitude towards other people and demonize them using facts and using concrete information from their past. So it's kind of quite dark. The way that we recognise us using these. So this is actually how the model looks in terms of a stack model, it's called. So if you look at the archetypes, so can you think about the archetypal slots at the side? They're like slots, and depending on what your personality type is, there's a particular order that these functions go into, and therefore are associated with those particular archetypes. So for me, like I said, the introverted intuition as a function, which is described on the sheets that you've got there, that's me, like, what's it like for me to introverted intuition? It's like I get completely disengaged from the world around me. I go kind of a strange sort of in-between kind of conscious state, and then things pop in my head. I have realizations or like hunches or insights, and that's such a familiar place for me. It's like, wow, actually, it's just, I'll be walking down the street, but you see me walking down the street, I'll be there questioning the connection between psychology and physics or something like that. There's some kind of like connections going off in my head, and I'm seeing like quantum physics and psychological time. That's just my world. It sounds quite bizarre. That's what I'm constantly drawn to, this introverted intuition. And that's a bit of a heroic function. It's something that I've always been doing, always been using, always been drawn to strongly, and therefore gets developed as a result of that. But I've got my extrovert thinking, my actual, like, taking concrete actions, a plan to make things happen in the world with direct cause and effect. I'm actually quite good at helping people with that. So if someone's struggling to get something done, I can actually sit them down and go, right, okay, maybe we can break this down into steps, and maybe you do that first, and then that, and then that. There's a chain reaction, and maybe we'll get where we want. And it's just natural for me to coach people using that function. For my internal child function, my internal feeling values are actually quite petulant, and I can go off on a rant, go, that's not right, that's wrong, it's just so, they shouldn't be doing that, that's the kind of thing. When you find your eternal child part, you notice just how it kind of stamps its feet, and it really starts to have this kind of like childlike quality to it. The anima animus, that's kind of a mysterious sort of part of ourselves, which as a result of being an opposite to the hero, gets suppressed. It's attached to the inferior function, which is the one that gets suppressed the most. And so it's something that really wants to come out in us, but actually for a long period of our life, we really kind of we suppress it. But it's always trying to explode out of us sometimes, right, in moments of stress. And then the shadow. Well, that's another thing. The shadow, the parts of ourselves which are in shadow, we kind of disown because they're destructive, because they're negative, because they tend to cause us problems in our relationships with other people, and they cause us problems in our own minds they can be self-critical, they can be sabotaging of our own will and what we're trying to achieve in life. And there's 4 different ways we do that. Opposing personality is a bit more meh. It's a bit like, it's not directly attacking people, but it's resisting and kind of, it's got that sort of kind of feel to it, and kind of irritating. Whereas a critical parent, is pretty direct and pretty mean. When you meet someone's critical parent, you've got to watch out. It's like if you trigger something in them and it'll be the function that's related to that which will trigger them, and then you just can't help it. You see it you see the shadow. LinkedIn and Facebook are so full of people like a shadow expressing out, and like there's so much hate and negativity. I don't even want to go there anymore. It's horrible. It just spawns shadow, like the social media. I think it's one of the worst things that's ever happened to the human race. It brings out the worst side of us. The tricksters kind of, it subverts people in a more kind of rude, like cheeky kind of nah sort of way. And we see trickster character. I mean, trickster it's my favourite archetype, and we see it. Who's into Shakespeare? Who's cultured?
A little bit more contemporary around here.
All right. No, I'm just laughing at it because I hadn't even, until my wife got me into it a few years ago, I'd never seen any Shakespeare. I was laughing at myself there. But the whole idea that fool character that they have in any Shakespeare play, what was that fool character? It's always subversive. It's like the jester in medieval times. It has that real subversive kind of thing. It can undermine like the king, but get away with it without having his head chopped off. It's got this kind of cheeky, sneaky, mischievous little way of doing things. trickster character is in every country's folklore and myths and legends. It's like, there's a great book which kind of talks about the clown in sort of Western culture is a trickster. So the demon daimon, that's quite dark because it's quite insidiously undermining. And we can demonize people, that's one of our darkest aspects. It really invalidates. When you're demonizing somebody, it's like you're saying you're worthless, you're nothing. It's pretty horrible. And unfortunately, it can do that part of ourselves can do the same to us. This is it drawn in the spine and arms model, and it's quite nice to see that this is literally the spine of the personality between the dominant function and the inferior, the hero and the animus. It's about the strongest polarity that we've got. It really shows the kind of opposition between these functions. So this is an interesting one in real life relationships. That's me and my dad there. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but it was really interesting. Just want to get a sense of how this sort of theory, it sounds like a crazy abstract theory, but it's a real life thing that you can actually experience with the people that you know. And this was my dad's. ESFJ was his type, so he was an extroverted feeling type, which is a lovely function, actually, very charming, very agreeable, very nice. He cared, he wanted to connect, he was very generous and kind. But actually, that was my trickster function. So we had this relationship, and the whole relationship was tinged with this shadowy quality to it, in the sense that I couldn't, especially when I was young, and this sort of, these unconscious archetypal parts of myself were really kind of just doing their own thing. That the wandering mind was gripping me a lot. I'm doing this. The whole relationship was changed by this thing whereby I would make fun of his. I was the trickster to his central sense of identity. I would kind of make fun of him so he would come in the door and he'd be all kind of, his extrovert feeling would want to connect with, hi, how you doing? It's really lovely to see you. And I would be like, hi, it's great to see you. This kind of thing. It'd be that's kind of trickstery, making fun of that sense of who he was. But he would do the same to me, where I was coming up with this sort of insightful, intuitive, abstract concepts and ideas. He always had this sense of laughing them off. So it's kind of, we can get into our relationships with the people that we love and care about can be really shaped by these qualities, And it's quite painful actually when you're in a relationship and these sort of conflicts come up, especially if you're a parent or a child and you can't. It's a relationship you're in for life, and these things are absolutely there. My wife and I. We've got some interesting part dynamics going on as well. So we have a really interesting parent-child-like dynamic going on between us. It's quite actually, her sort of her child's extrovert thinking can actually it can have this sense of when it's really trying to achieve something, get something done, it can get a bit kind of lost and along the way like a child can. It can really want some kind of validation for having achieved something. And actually I might be quite supportive of that. And she can be quite supportive of me. So it's quite a nice relationship. We can support each other in an area that we feel a little bit more childlike and less comfortable with. But in the shadow we've got this thing going on here. So for me, again, my extrovert feeling, besides making fun of my dad, it also led me to have a real sort of, kind of stick my nose up at convention and social etiquette and norms and things like that, which my wife's critical parent will pull me up on all the time. Anything that's socially out of place, straight away. And she calls it her witch. It's that's another way of looking at the critical mind. It's the witch and Senex or other archetypal words. But when you start to meet this in people and she knows it now, she's so familiar with this, we use this model, we talk about it, and it's great for our relationship to know it, so you don't take it personally anymore, because you're going, Because you know that your unconscious mind is just like, these parts of you are just coming out. They're just coming out. But the thing is, for me, my critical parent, when with her introvert thinking is being unclear and unspecific about her use of language, and her boundaries are kind of about in using language are not distinct, it can be quite mean to her about not being clear, not being analytical and distinct. They're quite mean parts, but they're there in everyday life, and they come up, and then we say sorry. Well, I'm interested. I don't know if you've read through these, just to I am on time. So that's quite good.
We've got about 2 minutes, Richard. We've got some
It's
conversation.
going well, isn't it? It's going well. So we'll have a look at this. We'll get back to this afterwards. So I'll just. People always go, "How's it useful, Richard? What's the point of all this crazy theory?" Okay, so part one is going to remove blame and shame, because if there is only one personality, which is you, which is your whole identity, you are this, you are that. Well, you don't need that anymore. Part of you is that. You see, it's much more easy to accept and therefore to develop and move on. You can become ashamed of being a certain type of person, but it's a lot harder to be completely ashamed of having a part of you which is not so nice, because at least there's other parts that kind of don't have that particular quality. This sort of model can validate our inner experience, especially when it comes to parts that conflict internally. It gives a model to understand that and realise that you're not going mad, that this is stuff that is actually there, and it's so common to people that everybody's experiencing something along this line. It explains interpersonal conflict using this sort of mapping method that I was talking about. Ultimately, it can increase your awareness and your integration of the unconscious mind, the stuff that's just gripping you and carrying you away in everyday life. It gives you compassion and understanding because of the understanding the parts of this, and helps you develop and become less one-sided. I've actually got a couple of weekends, so if you're interested, I've got a few places left on the one in Brighton. So if you're interested, this is a whole weekend to really explore these things and then continue it online afterwards. So if you actually want to sort of really explore the parts, it does take time. It's not something you can just do in like an hour. Because it took me several years to really get to grips with all of these as parts of my shadow as well. It's a real deep depth experience that, once you start using it, it can be very powerful. I just want to turn it over to you for a couple of minutes. Maybe just have a chat to the people next to you and see if you've recognised from that sheet any part of you that it might be more central to you. It might be what they call your hero part, that's something like a gift that you might make a difference in the world.
Can I just say on the timing front, if we just spend a few minutes on this, ask any questions that need to be done, because we do need to be out of here by about 3 past at the latest. So just a few minutes discussion, pick Richard's brains, and then to the pub.
Come out to the pub afterwards as well, because that's always the fun part of these things as well. So, thank you for your attention.
Can I ask you a question? So the archetypes are scattered, like you could associate any of those 8 with any of those 8.
I believe that we've got all those 64 combinations as our potentials. Yeah.
But I would tend to, if I had my extroverted intuition, would be most akin to one of those archetypes.
That's right, yeah.
But it could be any of them.
There is like when I was showing you this before, there is a way that this maps out. There is a logic to how these functions fit into these slots, essentially.
But I would need to know what the ENFP one would be.
Yeah, I can tell you that later. Yeah. So there is a logic to that, yeah.
Okay, so it isn't the case that any can go with any?
No, for each particular type, people will recognise a certain mapping of those parts.
Okay.
But I believe that as you then go beyond that and develop, that there is the potential to have all 64 ways of doing it. You could have there's 8 ways to be a hero. Put it that way, I think we all have a hero's journey where we're going to go through life to try and master at least to some degree all of these 8 functions. Because they're very useful.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a publication that has the spec model for each of the...
I think John's book does, yeah, I believe so. Yeah, John's book will have it. John Beebe. It's pronounced Beebe. Yeah.
So I was a bit confused as to how this relates to dissociative identity disorder,
Mm.
and how we can look at the personality parts and how it will relate to that.
Okay, so in terms of mental illness, like which dissociative identity disorder would be classed under, that's a very extreme splitting of parts where some parts, it's like the family breaks up, and some of them don't talk to the others anymore. And they can act out and take over at different points without even realising that the other ones exist. I mean, most of us, there's some splitting, but we've got a central awareness that there is some relationship between them, and that we know that there is still some central ground to who we are. We're not just completely being taken over and only flipping into one or the other.
Okay. And how many parts could there be in DID?
How many parts? Good question. I'm not an expert on that because I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I don't know. Good question. It could be 64. Who knows?
In an organisational context, what do you see as being the main benefits of having an understanding of this?
So any relationships, where you're spending a lot of time with somebody, as you do in the workplace, you start to see these parts coming out, and it really helps you to actually understand and have compassion for the people that you're with, spending time with, because you can also start to interact with people more effectively, I think, through knowing this and knowing what will trigger off their shadow, for instance, and things like that. What will bring out their dark side. So it can be great, really, really insightful to know about people through this.
Yeah, because I'm thinking as a consultant, how could I use this?
How could you use it? We could get people, to map out what conflicts they may be having and understand that. So people take it less personally then. Go, yes, hang on, there's things unconsciously acting out through me, but then once you're aware of that, it starts to give you a choice. Otherwise you're carried away. The unconscious mind is just gripping you or taking you with it, and then you're in it. You don't have a chance to step back. So this model gives you a distance to step back from the parts, and then you've actually got some way of integrating a much more effective way of behaving, really, because you've got a choice rather than just being gripped.
Are there case studies actually?
Are there case studies?
Yeah.
Good question. Probably, I could tell you things myself, but it's quite early days really for this stuff, and in terms of it's very difficult to research, but if anyone wants to do it as part of a qualification, let me know.
Richard, just think about it. So this, you can see it's a real evolution from the old school Myers-Briggs as it used to be. Has anybody done the work to link it into the evolution from the transactional analysis point of view, in terms of it's no longer parent, adult, child, it's functional fluency, Anita Mountain's work, all that sort of stuff, which has a very different take on the different states. So it's just thinking that the language is slightly different now. So
yeah, I've been doing some comparative work myself between the two models. They come from different sort of backgrounds and different philosophies, because transactional analysis doesn't have archetypes. They say you kind of literally pick up your parent likeness from your actual parents or from parent-like figures. But it's a completely different way of looking at where these things come from. But I guess, no, I'm probably the person most absorbed by these sort of questions myself, I'd imagine.
And you said that when we're in a state of unconscious attention, we go back to our basic traits, to who we kind of really are. Would you say if we pay more attention to one trait, to one type that we are, we can amplify that part of ourselves? Or do you think that's just pre-given and we can't shape that even in early stages of childhood?
Well, this is interesting, to say you shape it is kind of implying that you're then using your executive attention to be a certain way. I guess that's the thing, isn't it? We get, and this is where type is really interesting, because your unconscious mind is trying to pull you a certain way to be a certain person. And you can try and override that consciously and go, no, I'm going to be like this, and make a decision. But actually what you find is like people burn out quite quickly trying to do that and end up in therapy.
Could it be shaped like early on in childhood, or like by social standards?
I think often certainly society and parents and things like that have a massive impact on what we think we should be. But if that's not in alignment with what our unconscious mind's trying to make us be, then there's a bit of conflict going on. And there's only so far you can shape yourself against, to be who you're not. I think people land in a lot of trouble doing that. I've seen the repercussions of it. People like compulsively break down as a result of trying to force themselves to be out of alignment with their natural self. So yeah, it's quite serious stuff. I hope that's the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions? No? In that case, I think big appreciation for that.